This is ALHS 1011, and this is Module 5, the digestive or gastrointestinal system. Okay, here are our learning objectives for this chapter. Okay, the gastrointestinal system overview. The digestive tract is also sometimes called the alimentary tract or canal, and it is a hollow muscular tube that contains the organs of digestion. The tube begins at the mouth and ends at the anus. Here is a nice visual of kind of the length, if we had stretched out the GI tract, how long everything would be. So we have the mouth, the oral cavity, tongue, esophagus, stomach, some accessory organs. And then starting here, we have the small intestine. And that is almost 6 meters. It's pretty long. So if you stretched it out, this is the length of it. So the first part up to the jejunum is 1 meter, but this entire section of small intestine is about 6. And then we have another 1.5 meters of large intestine. So it's fairly long. So it's rolled up, it's compacted inside our bodies. We're going to focus on there's 2 main ways that food is broken down: mechanical, physical, and chemical. Mechanical is or physical is the actual churning movement. Physical means that food is broken down, and chemical would be using exactly what it sounds like, chemicals to digest or break down food. Okay, so we'll start at the oral or buccal cavity. Buccal really means cheeks, oral meaning mouth. So we have the lips or the labia of the mouth. The mouth receives taste. It mechanically breaks down food. Starch digestion begins in the mouth. We have the hard and soft palate or the roof of the mouth. We have the tongue at the floor of the mouth, and the cheeks are the walls. So I've highlighted here ones that you're going to definitely want to be sure to know. The gingiva, that's the gums. They help to keep teeth in place, and they are really epithelial cells forming a tight seal around every tooth to prevent bacteria from coming in contact with the tooth's cementum. Okay, a little bit about the teeth. Teeth are deciduous, which means just like deciduous trees, they fall out. So our baby teeth fall out over time. A first tooth in a baby appears about 6 months old. Usually it's the lower central incisors that appear first. And a 2.5-year-old, usually by 2.5, you have about 20 teeth. As you age, the teeth fall out. They're deciduous. And between 6 and 12 years old, all of your deciduous teeth will fall out, and you will get 32 permanent teeth. And wisdom teeth appear by age 21. So here are the types of teeth. Incisors, to incise means to cut. So incisors are sharp and pointy. They look like almost like knives, blade shaped. They're located in the front of the mouth, and they're used to cut food. Your canines are hold food, tear, slash. Excuse me. They are also called the eye teeth or the cuspids. They're located next to the incisors. Your bicuspids are premolars. They're transitional teeth. Their action is more crushing and grinding. And then your molars are flattened, and they definitely do crushing and grinding. So here's a nice visual. We have our incisors in front, on top and bottom, central incisors. This is the 20 deciduous teeth that a child has. These are the 32 adult teeth. So we have the incisors up front, then we have the cuspids, then we have premolars and molars. Okay. This is what it looks like jaw to jaw. We have inside, and teeth match each other. Upper and lower jaws match each other. So we have the incisors, the cuspids or the canines, the bicuspids or the premolars, and then the molars. And we have a nice diagram here of the cross section of the tooth, and we'll get into that. Okay, so tooth anatomy. We have the crown. The crown is the visible part, the white part, covered by enamel. And enamel is the hardest biologically manufactured substance. So this is the hardest substance in our body. You have the neck of the tooth. That's the transitional section that leads to the root. So you have the crown, the neck, and the root. Internally, most teeth are made of dentin. Dentin is a mineralized bone substance. Next, internally, is the pulp, and the pulp is connective tissue. It's located in a pulp cavity. That pulp cavity contains blood vessels and nerves, and it reaches down to the root canal. Okay? The root is nestled in the bony socket, and it's held together in place by the fibers of the periodontal ligament. And we have cementum, which is also called the periodontal membrane, that covers the dentin and aids in the securing of the periodontal ligament. So we really want our teeth to stay in place, obviously. They go through a lot of abuse through our lifetime. And they need to be strong and hard and in place. Next is the oral cavity. We have the tongue. The tongue is the taste organ, and it provides taste stimuli to the brain. It determines the temperature of food, manipulates the food. The tongue's base in the back is the area of attachment. The uvula, the tongue's base and the uvula are a barrier to the pharynx. So the next part would be the pharynx or the throat. But before we get to the pharynx, let's talk about some salivary glands. So we have 3 pairs of salivary glands controlled by the autonomic nervous system. We have the parotid gland, which is slightly inferior and anterior to the ear. So it's right in front of and a little lower than the ear. We have the sublingual glands, which, just like it sounds like, is underneath the tongue. We have the submandibular salivary glands that are along the sides and inner surface of the mandible. These ducts empty into the oral cavity. They pour saliva into the oral cavity. Here's a really nice picture. So we have the parotid glands, which are right here, a little inferior and in front of the ear. And then a parotid duct where it pours the salivary saliva into the mouth. We have the sublingual glands and ducts, and then we have the submandibular, under the mandible. So all of these circular, look like popcorn, glands are pouring saliva. Saliva, I love this picture, drool. Saliva is, we produce a liter. I don't know if you know what a liter looks like. It's like an IV bag. A liter to a liter and a half of saliva gets produced daily. We keep small amounts in our mouth at all times to keep our mouth moist. But just the idea or presence of food or the smell of food increases production significantly. Saliva is 99.4% water, And the rest of it is antibodies, buffers, ions, waste products, and enzymes. Now, I mentioned that digestion of starch happens in the mouth. Ptyalin or salivary amylase, anytime you see a word that ends in ASE, that indicates an enzyme. Salivary amylase breaks down carbohydrates or starch. So starch digestion begins in the mouth. After eating, saliva cleans out the oral surfaces, reducing the amount of bacteria in the mouth. So saliva has a really, really important function. After the uvula in the base of the tongue, we have the pharynx. There are three parts to the pharynx. The nasopharynx, which is, as you know from the respiratory chapter, adjacent to the nose, okay, partially blocked off by the soft palate. Then we have the oropharynx, adjacent to the mouth, and the laryngopharynx, which is the passageway for food, water, and air. And then we have that all-important epiglottis. And the epiglottis covers the trachea when we are swallowing food or water or liquid from entering the lungs. And it forces food through the opening of the esophagus. So we want food and water or liquid to go down the esophagus, only air in the trachea. So that epiglottis plays an important role. Okay. The fancy word for swallowing is deglutition. So what happens when we swallow? We eat, we take in food, and the tongue will push this ball-like mass, or what we call a bolus. So let's think about it going from food to bolus. It moistens it, some starch digestion happens, and then that becomes a bolus. And when we swallow it, the uvula, that little hanging thing in the back of your throat, directs the food to the pharynx and blocks the food from entering the nose. Now, you can change that with some serious laughing and end up with food coming up your nose. The lingual frenulum is a membrane underneath the tongue, and that prevents us from we cannot really swallow our tongue. So underneath the tongue is the frenulum, and if someone says that they're tongue-tied, that means their frenulum is too tight. That membrane holds the tongue in place and prevents us from swallowing it. It also aids us in speaking. Okay, I don't know why the S is lower here, but this is the esophagus. It is about 10 inches long, and it's normally squished. It's normally collapsed. So unlike the trachea, which has cartilage rings holding it open, the esophagus is usually folded and collapsed unless it's being used. It extends from the pharynx, the throat, through the thoracic cavity, through the diaphragm, and connects to the stomach in the peritoneal cavity. Rhythmic contractions. So this picture is nice. It's kind of like squeezing Play-Doh through some kind of flexible membrane. Rhythmic contractions called peristalsis push food down the esophagus. So we can swallow, we can eat something and then hang upside down, and I wouldn't recommend that, but these rhythmic contractions are going to push food from the pharynx to the stomach. Okay, there's smooth muscles lining the esophagus. So, okay, again about the esophagus walls, it's lined with stratified squamous epithelial. And this is kind of key that the outer layer is adventitia, not serosa. So most of the GI tract has a serosa membrane, not the esophagus. It's just adventitia. We have two sphincters. Okay, remember those are muscular rings that open and close and allow movement. Okay, we have one at the top of the esophagus and one at the bottom of the esophagus, right at the stomach. So talking about the top one first, we call that the pharyngoesophageal sphincter or the upper esophageal sphincter. And that's the muscular ring on the top. And that will relax to open the esophagus so food can enter. Moving down, peristalsis down the esophagus, we have the lower esophageal sphincter, or we also commonly call that this cardiac sphincter. That is the entrance to a stomach, and that relaxes to let food in. It also protects the esophagus because that stomach acid, if you remember, that has a pH of 2, very, very, very acidic. Will take the paint off a car if you vomit it outside a car. We don't want that acidic content coming up through the esophagus, giving us heartburn and destroying the lining of that beautiful esophagus. So that lower esophageal sphincter opens and closes to prevent splashing of gastric juices back up. Now, eating late at night, smoking, alcohol, I think caffeine can relax that sphincter, causing what we know as heartburn or gastroesophageal reflux. So sometimes we do have heartburn. This is a cross section of the esophagus. As we said before, food becomes bolus, right? We no longer call it food anymore. The epiglottis closes, the food goes down to the esophagus. We have that pharyngoesophageal sphincter at the top. And then we have peristalsis squeezing down the esophagus, and that bolus goes through the diaphragm to the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay. And then the bolus can enter the stomach. Here is a nice, the big diagram is the diaphragm here. We have a lumen, just means opening. We have a serous membrane here. We have mucosa, submucosa, and then the muscular layer. Okay. So this is what swallowing looks like. We have a bolus of food. The upper esophageal sphincter closes. That tongue blocks off the oral cavity so that we don't bring food up to our nose too. The epiglottis blocks the larynx and the trachea, and food can come down. And then that upper esophageal sphincter is going to close behind the bolus. Okay, the walls of the alimentary canal. Okay. So the mucosa is the innermost. We want the mucosa. We want mucus. Okay. This is the lumen, the opening. Then the next layer is the mucosa. That's the innermost layer of the lumen of the canal. And that secretes enzymes and mucosal lubrication. We want some mucus to help things slide down. The next layer is the submucosa. That is soft connective tissue that contains the vessels, the nerves, the lymph. Now, this is most of the canal, not specifically the esophagus. We'll talk about the esophagus separately in a second. Then we have 2 layers of muscle, which is called the muscularis externa. And then we have serosa, which is visceral, next to the organ, peritoneum. It is single, it is thin, it was flat, and the serous fluid producing cells are located in the serosa. Now, remember I said I was going to come back to the esophagus. This differs from the esophagus, which only has adventitia, a loose layer of tissue. So we don't have that serous membrane over the esophagus. Okay, so here's the lumen, the mucosa, epithelial cells. We got some lymphatic tissue. So we have the mucosal layer. Then we have the submucosal layer containing blood vessels and nerves and lymph. And then we have the 2 muscular layers that control peristalsis, and then the serosa layer. Okay, I mentioned the peritoneum. This is similar, remember the tissues chapter in the membranes. This is similar to the pericardium and the pleura. Okay. So you have two layers to the balloon or the membrane. You have a parietal layer, that's the outside layer. Then you have peritoneal fluid, right? And then the visceral peritoneum, those are the ones that line the organs. So visceral covers and lines the organs, parietal covers and lines the outside or the abdominopelvic cavity. And we have fluid in the space called the peritoneal cavity. So all of our organs are floating, are kind of being held together and floating around in this membranous, like water balloon. The peritoneum is a little different from other serous membranes in that they're not, in that some of the abdominal organs are retroperitoneal, retro meaning backward. So some of them are not encompassed. They're not contained within the peritoneum. They're retroperitoneal. They're behind it. The kidneys are specifically retroperitoneal. They're behind the peritoneum. Also in the peritoneum, there's extensions or kind of folds that drape over abdominal organs, and those are called the mesentery. Okay. So we have the peritoneum right here. We have visceral peritoneum, which is lining the organ. Then we have the parietal that's lining the cavity. Then mesentery, we have all these folds and inlets and islands and detours and cul-de-sacs. Okay, the stomach, located in the left side of the abdominal cavity underneath the diaphragm and covered completely by the liver. It is about 10 inches long. Its diameter just depends, it stretches. So depending on what you just ate, depends on how big it is. It can hold up to 4 liters when filled. That's amazing. It has rugae or folds inside to help it expand and contract. So that's what allows it to stretch. Okay. Here's the stomach in a diagram picture and as well as a cadaver. The fundus is the top of the stomach. The body is the main part. Then we have the cardiac sphincter, which we also called the lower esophageal sphincter. We have another sphincter to introduce here called the pyloric sphincter, and that holds food in the stomach before it can get to the small intestine or the duodenum. The stomach has different layers. It has a mucosal layer. Thank goodness, because we needed to secrete mucus, right? It has a submucosal layer. It has a muscular layer. The stomach does a lot of churning and movement, so it does physical digestion as well as chemical. It's got rugae. It's got the grooves and folds, okay, to allow it to stretch. And then below you see a cadaver picture, okay, it's less colorful, but fundus, the cardiac sphincter, which the cardiac region is right below that. We have the fundus in the body. It shows rugae here. We have we call the curves of the stomach the large curve. In the outside, we call that the greater curvature. And the inside curve, we call the lesser curvature. The pyloric region is around the pylorus or pyloric sphincter. And then here's the pyloric sphincter before we get to the small intestine, the first section called the duodenum. Okay, then we have, just like the brain, we have these regions, and I kind of went over them, but let's look at them. And I love this colorful picture that really helps. So you have the esophagus, then you have the lower esophageal sphincter or the cardiac sphincter, right? The cardiac region is that first region. right below the cardiac sphincter. Okay. The fundus is that top curvature. Okay. Then we have the body, the main part, with the greater curvature and the lesser curvature. The pyloric region is right before the pyloric sphincter. So here are the functions or the physiology of the stomach. It temporarily stores food. It holds food there. Okay. It secretes gastric acids and enzymes that mix with food and perform some chemical digestion. Okay. So first we had the salivary amylase that turned food into a bolus. And now we get the food, the bolus, down to the stomach. And now we call the food / bolus, we call it chyme. Chyme is as it's in the stomach. And the stomach regulates the rate of this newly digested food. It says, when is it a good time for that to enter the intestines? So it does its job, and then it decides, it makes a regulation call when it's going to move the food into the intestines. In the stomach, we do have some absorption, not a lot, but some absorption, small amounts of water and substances, but alcohol does not get absorbed in the stomach. Muscle layers of the stomach. So we have the mucosa, secreting mucus. We have the submucosa with the nerves, the blood vessels, the lymph. Now we have some muscular layers. And the muscles work the stomach like a cement mixer. So there's a longitudinal, a circular, and an oblique layer that move in a circular motion like a cement mixer, mixing and churning the food. So in the stomach, we have mechanical or physical digestion and chemical. In the stomach, I mentioned the mucosa layer. These mucus cells in the stomach produce alkaline mucus, kind of to neutralize things and protect the stomach from eating itself. Remember, the stomach from the endocrine chapter has some endocrine function. So the endocrine cells in the stomach produce gastrin. Okay. We have parietal cells that produce hydrochloric acid, very acidic, and intrinsic factor. We need intrinsic factor to absorb vitamin B12. They have chief cells, which produce pepsinogen and gastric lipase. Wait, warning, warning. I said anytime you see a word ending in ASE, it's typically an enzyme. So this lipase, gastric lipase, digests lipids or fats. There are also regenerative cells that are stem cells in there to replace other cells. So gastric juice, okay, made of hydrochloric acid or HCl, pepsinogen, and mucus. Chief cells secrete the pepsinogen. Parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and combine to produce pepsin. And pepsin is an important digestive enzyme. I know it doesn't end in ASE, but it is an enzyme. Pepsin digests protein. So we had amylase that digested carbohydrates. Now we're digesting protein. We also had lipase that digests fats. So hydrochloric acid will break down connective tissue. Hydrochloric acid has a very low pH, 1.5 to 2, and it's effective at killing pathogens. So sometimes if you eat something and it's contaminated, just entering the stomach with that pH will kill some pathogens. That HCl also activates the lipase, which digests fat. Okay, so how do we go from food to bolus to chyme? Making the chyme, the hydrochloric acid changes that pepsinogen to pepsin, and that really starts the protein digestion process. Then it also activates lingual lipase, which partially digests it. Remember, lipase, digests the lipids along with the gastric lipase. So both lipases are at work here. Then the intrinsic factor will bind to anything that we've ingested with vitamin B12 so that it can be absorbed later. So very important for vitamin B12 absorption. So all of these gastric enzymes and secretions mix with the bolus, and now it's called chyme. Okay. And here's another really nice picture of the chief cells and the parietal cells and all the pits that create the gastric juices. We have another negative feedback loop. Remember homeostasis being so important with everything within this course. pH of chyme falls, right? We had it was okay. It was a bolus. It came to the stomach, and now it's about a 2. Very acidic. The endocrine cells stop producing acid. And what happens is this change in pH, this regulatory change, causes the pyloric sphincter to open. And now the chyme will leave the stomach and enter the duodenum, which is the first section of the small intestine. Mucus cells, an intrinsic factor. So mucus cells in the mucosa are going to generate that nice mucus alkaline. I know that sounds disgusting, but it's protecting the stomach from the stomach acids. It's making it so our stomach doesn't digest itself. The stomach is also going to secrete the intrinsic factor, allowing that B12 to be absorbed. Okay, so we're working the food through that churning cement mixture action towards the pyloric sphincter through that peristaltic activity of the muscles. It takes about 4 hours for the stomach to empty after following a meal. One of the reasons you shouldn't eat late at night, because you don't want to be trying to digest and sleeping and laying flat. Liquids and carbohydrates pass through more quickly. That's why we're hungry when we eat those more fast. Proteins a little longer. They'll hang out in your stomach and satisfy you longer. Fats take the longest, and that will stay in your system 4 to 6 hours. Here are the different kind of phases of stomach activity. We have the cephalic stage, so cephalo, head, right? Brain or head. The medulla oblongata, that all important medulla oblongata, is going to send a message down the vagus nerve telling our stomach to increase activity, start secreting, start producing, okay? Then the gastric phase, the food enters, there's a little distension, the rugae kind of open things up. We have gastrin, we have gastric juice. And then the intestinal phase is when that bolus has become chyme and we are moving that chyme through the pyloric sphincter into the duodenum. So I mentioned that the stomach regulates, right? We have the vagus nerve through the parasympathetic nervous system, and the vagus nerve is a cranial nerve. The vagus nerve stimulates and increases the motility and secretory rates of the gastric glands. So it's going to say, you know, how fast do you move? How much secretion do you do? Okay. When we have sympathetic neurons, so if there is a fight or flight response, the celiac ganglion suppress digestion. We don't really care if we digest, we want to run from that danger. So it diverts the blood to the skeletal muscles in the heart and kind of slows down digestion. Not totally necessary at this moment. We need to run or fight. So controlling the rate of movement. So how, like I mentioned, like how fast different food move through the stomach. The rate of movement is very, very important. If things move too slowly, then the nutrients are not necessarily digested. They're not absorption happens mostly in the small intestine, so absorption is decreased. It may allow some of that chyme, if it's not moving fast enough, it may hurt the stomach lining or erode the stomach lining. If it moves too quickly, food particles, again, are not going to get digested properly or absorbed properly. So too fast and too slow are not good. Okay, so we've now made it to the pyloric sphincter in the duodenum of the small intestine. We're going to pause right there and talk about the accessory organs that are not part of the tract, but are absolutely necessary for our digestion. So they're not part of that initial tubing. Okay. We have the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. The liver, the all important liver, weighs about 1.5 kilograms, located inferior, lower than the diaphragm, largest glandular organ in the body, largest organ in the abdominopelvic cavity. So larger than the stomach is the liver. It's got 4 lobes or lobules, the right, the left, the caudate, and the quadrate. The liver receives about 1 to 1.5 quarts of blood every minute from the hepatic, that means liver, portal vein. And it carries blood full to the end of the products of digestion. And then the hepatic artery brings that liver some nice oxygen-rich blood. So you've got the liver here. See, it's huge. You have hepatic veins, the liver, the gallbladder are located here. We'll talk about that in a second. The hepatic portal vein, and then some mesenteric. See how these veins are really servicing the mesentery. Okay. We have a hepatic duct. We have a cystic duct. We're going to talk about the gallbladder and the common bile duct. So where did we leave off here? We left off at the pyloric sphincter right here. So you can see its kind of proximity to the liver and the gallbladder. Okay. So we're going to see some action here from the liver and the gallbladder dumping secretions into the duodenum, or that first part of the small intestine. Okay, functions of the liver, part 1. Part 1. It detoxes. It detoxifies anything. It detoxifies, also the kidneys do, but it detoxifies certain drugs and alcohol. It destroys old blood cells. It says, you're not functioning well, you're too old, and it's going to recycle usable parts and eliminate anything that's not needed. It's going to store and modify fats. It's going to store glycogen, if you remember, glucose in the form of glycogen in the liver. And so if we need that glycogen, we can break it down and have readily available glucose to bring up low blood sugar. And it stores ions and vitamins such as A, B12, D, E, and K. And just for your knowledge, A, not B12, but A, D, E, K, or ADEC, are all fat-soluble only vitamins. So they do get stored by the body. So producing the liver, body heat gets produced by the liver, very vascular organ. Cholesterol gets produced by the liver. Bile. We need bile for the digestion of fats. Urea is a byproduct from protein metabolism. So when we break down protein, that urea is one of the results. Blood plasma proteins such as albumin and globulin, also clotting factors we need for wound healing, such as fibrinogen and prothrombin. So clotting factors, but also blood thinners such as an anticoagulant, preventing coagulation, heparin. It also makes heparin. So this is a very, very, very important organ. It detox, it makes things, it stores things, it regulates blood glucose, bile, so many important things. The liver is a necessary organ. So bile, if you've ever, not to be gross, but thrown up and thrown up and throw it up, and then at the end of the retching, there is this lovely green, dark green secretion that is bile. And bile is very important. So secretin stimulates bile production from the liver. We just said that the liver produces bile. So secretin kind of turns that on. Bile allows us to emulsify, emulsification. So we take the bile acid and lecithin, and that acts as a detergent, breaking up fat. So if you know anything about like salad dressing, we have fat, it separates, you have fat and water below. The water and the fat do not mix. So we need a detergent to break up those fat molecules. The bile helps us absorb fat, right, from the small intestine. It transports bilirubin and excess cholesterol to the intestine for elimination. So very, very important, keeping things in check. And bile, it leaves the hepatic duct, travels through the cystic duct to the gallbladder, where it is stored until needed. So if you eat a very fatty meal, your body is going to secrete excess bile to try to break that down. So we have the liver, and the liver produces bile. Secretin says to the liver, produce more bile. And then that bile is going to leave the liver through the right and left hepatic ducts, go through the cystic duct, and be stored in the gallbladder. And we'll talk about what happens from there next. The gallbladder. Okay, so the gallbladder, we can live without. If we don't have it, we don't store the bile there. It is pear-shaped. It's about 3 to 4 inches long, and it's located right tucked underneath the liver's right lobe. So it is going to store any excess bile overflow. It's also going to concentrate bile by absorbing some water. So it's going to make it more concentrated. Okay. Sometimes if we over concentrate the bile, that's when we get gallstones. So gallstones are an unfortunate product of us taking out too much water. Okay, so what does the gallbladder do? We eat fatty foods. That ends up entering the duodenum, the small intestine. That causes CCK, or cholecystokinin. Okay, we'll call it CCK from here on out. Chole means gall, cysto bladder. So gallbladder kinin, okay? This CCK gets released, and the smooth muscles of the walls of the gallbladder are going to now contract, squeezing that bile into the cystic duct through a sphincter called the hepatoliver pancreatic sphincter, into the common bile duct, and now into the duodenum. So that's how, fatty acids are going to, or fatty foods are going to say, entering the duodenum are going to trigger CCK. CCK is going to squeeze the gallbladder. Any bile in there is going to enter the duodenum through the cystic duct by the hepatopancreatic sphincter. And that's how we end up with bile in the small intestine. We told you that, and we know from the endocrine chapter, that pancreas is an endocrine gland. It is also exocrine. It is 6 to 9 inches long, located below or posterior in the back of the stomach, and it extends laterally from the duodenum to the spleen. So that's where it's kind of located in the body. Okay, so how does it function as exocrine? Exocrine meaning it secretes something through ducts. It's going to secrete buffers. So bicarbonate and digestive. Bicarbonate is going to be a buffer. It's going to neutralize acid and alkalinity. And digestive enzymes through the pancreatic duct. So from the pancreas, it's secreting through the pancreatic duct. It's going to buffer the chyme, I want to call it chyme's acidity to a pH. It brings it from a 2 to a 7.5 or 8.8. Thank goodness. Okay. Much more basic, alkaline. And it saves the intestinal walls from acid damage. This whole process, secretory action, the secreting, is activated by a release of hormones. Okay, so bile from the gallbladder and the liver emulsify or break down fat, allowing it to mix with water. The pancreatic juice contains sodium bicarbonate, which is a buffer, and enzymes to digest. Here are some of the pancreatic enzymes. Remember the ASE, the enzymes, ACE? So carbohydrase works on sugar and starches. We also had amylase in the saliva. Lipase works on livers. Proteinase works on proteins. And nuclease breaks down nucleic acids. Here's a little chart of some of the where the different enzymes are located and what they digest. Right? And a lot of it, as you can see, we have some salivary amylase in the mouth, but most of the site of release of these digestive enzymes are located in the small intestine. That's where the magic happens. Okay, so you have digestive enzyme secreting cells, hormones playing a part in this. Here is the pancreas with the pancreatic duct leading into the small intestine. The liver is up top. The common, the cystic duct from the gallbladder is going to, if the CCK tells it to squeeze, it's going to squeeze some bile to digest fats. Okay, so I've mentioned how important the small intestine is, and it is. It's centrally located in the lower abdomen. This is where most of your food is digested. A lot of people think it's the stomach. It's not. Okay, most of the food is digested in the small intestine. It's small in diameter, but not in length. Remember, it is 6 to 20 feet long. Its diameter is about 4 centimeters where it connects to the stomach, and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller to 2.5 centimeters. Okay, here we have the stomach, the pyloric sphincter, the duodenum, some circular folds in there. The next section of the small intestine, we have the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. So it's DJI, duodenum, jejunum, ileum. The next section is the jejunum. Then we have the ileum. We have some mesentery here, the folds of the peritoneum. Okay. You have your appendix. You have your cecum. We'll talk about all this. Okay. So from the pyloric valve, chyme is allowed to enter the duodenum. And the small intestine can only process small amounts of food at a time. So it kind of rhythmically, it doesn't just open and pour out. It rhythmically allows the chyme to move through. So this stationary contracting in ring-like patterns is called segmentation. So it moves segments of the chyme through. And then peristalsis is more like wave-like movement through the jejunum, through the ileum. Okay, regions. I mentioned DJI, so duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. The ileum ends and connects to the large intestine by something called the ileocecal valve. And here are the lengths of everything. Okay, so the walls of the small intestine. We have lots of curvatures and some villi. The villi are very, very important. And you can see that in the top picture here. They're like finger-like projections. So we have circular folds in the small intestine and villi. Villi are like really large cilia, but they're finger-like projections. And each villus or villi has a network of capillaries. And the lymphatic capillary is called a lacteal. Okay? We have intestinal glands located between each villi. Okay, so here's the villi again. They have capillaries. They do a lot of absorption. They transport nutrients to the liver for further processing. The lipids that are digested become chyle, which are absorbed in by the lymphatic system. Their villi are tightly packed together, so they give like a velvety appearance. And then the outer layer of the villi are columnar epithelial cells, which contain microvilli. Okay, functions of the small intestine. So small intestine, remember, the majority of digestion happens here. We have digestive enzymes entering here. We have a lot of absorption of nutrients here. And then the movement of chyme. So absorption is a major, major, major part. 80% of all absorption of usable nutrients happens when the chyme enters the small intestine in the mucosal walls. So amino acids, fatty acids, sugars, vitamins, water, all absorbed here. The remaining 20% is absorbed in the stomach. So not a lot of absorption happens in the large intestine. Any residue not utilized, anything that's a waste product, is now going to be moved down to the large intestine for removal. So in the duodenum, the first section of the small intestine, this is when intestinal, pancreatic, digestive enzymes are secreted. A lot of enzyme release happens here. There's that chyme gets mechanically and chemically irritated. It causes distension or bloating of the intestinal walls, which causes a localized reflex that says we need to release, that causes the release of enzymes and 2 more hormones. So I mentioned the hormones, right? CCK, so that chyme enters the duodenum. That triggers CCK to tell the gallbladder to squeeze and release some bile. So the duodenum secretes the CCK. Secretin stimulates the liver and the pancreas to release bicarbonate and water, which neutralizes stomach activity, neutralizes the acid. We need that bicarbonate. Okay, now the small intestine is going to meet the large intestine at the ileocecal orifice or the ileocecal valve, and that extends down to the anus. It borders or outlines the small intestine. The haustra are pouches. If you see, this looks like pouches, almost like little balloons, formed by longitudinal bands of small muscle called the taenia coli. So there are regions to the small intestine. So from the ileocecal valve, right here, the ileum, we have the cecum is the first part. And then the large intestine is called the colon. Following the colon, we have the rectum. So these are the main sections. Start with the cecum. The cecum is a pouch-shaped structure. It receives undigested food and water from the ileum. Off of it is this tiny little finger-like 3-inch projection. It's a little dead-ended tube. It's lined with lymphoid tissue, and that's where the appendix is. The cecum may replenish any beneficial bacteria that was destroyed in the digestive tract. There are 4 sections to the colon. So the rest of past the cecum is called the colon. So ascending, this is the direction that the matter moves. Up, ascending. Transverse goes across the abdomen. Descending goes down. And then sigmoid is supposed to look like an S. And it bends down near the spleen and travels to the rectum. If you were to have a colostomy or an opening in your colon, depending on the location of that opening or stomy would depend on how solid or liquid the stool is that comes out. Okay. So if you had a colostomy and you had a functioning stoma, if you had one over here in the ascending or even transverse colon, it's going to be more liquid because the water hasn't had a chance to be removed in the colon yet. Descending or sigmoid would be solid. Okay, following the large intestine is the rectum and the anus, and the rectum is a storage tank. It opens to the anal canal. The anal sphincter opens and closes, allowing the passage of feces or solid waste. In the anus, they have internal and external sphincters. So the internal sphincter is going to relax and open, and it's the external sphincter that has a conscious control. So it only relaxes when we decide to open it. So we have control within limits on how often and when defecation happens. The large intestine, the main function of the large intestine is water absorption. So most of it is making that chyme solid. Water gets absorbed. Also, bacteria in the colon may produce some vitamin K, which we need for clotting, and flatus, which is gas. It's going to package, compact the waste to form feces that can be eliminated from the body. It has no villi, so very little absorption is happening here. So hence, we can take out part of the colon or bypass part of the colon with a stoma, and it doesn't really affect our nutrition. So bacteria in the bowel is very, very, very important. This is your important healthy bacteria. Okay. They call the bowel the second brain or the little brain. A lot happens here, and it's still being scientifically discovered. Bacteria are going to help break down indigestible materials. It's going to produce some B complex vitamins that we need and vitamin K that we need for proper clotting. On a side note, if you've ever taken an antibiotic, it sometimes indiscriminately kills the bad bacteria and the good bacteria. And then you end up with an opportunistic infection, which can cause diarrhea. We need the good bacteria in our gut to keep things in balance. Defecation. So the rectum, the storage tank, fills with feces. The defecation, we have a defecation reflex, the feeling of I need to go. The rectal muscles will contract and the anal sphincter relaxes. If this moves through the system too rapidly and it doesn't allow water to be removed, we have diarrhea. If it's too long in the large intestine and too much water gets removed, then constipation happens. Okay, so this is affected from the brain, the defecation reflex. There are stretch receptors in the rectum that tell the brain, okay, it's time to go. And the internal and external sphincter, if we're ready for it, tells us it's time to defecate. Okay, summarizing the functions of the GI tract. Ingestion, we're taking food in. This is how we take food in. Mastication, I'm not sure we use that word, but that means chewing. That's another physical or mechanical digestive process. We grind the food down. We're not swallowing whole food, hopefully. Grinding food down with our teeth and our tongue using the muscles of our jaw. Then chemical digestion happens when the food is broken down into smaller molecules. Secretion, lots of things are secreted. Acids, buffers, enzymes, and water aid in the breakdown of food. Absorption, this is how we absorb nutrients from mostly the small intestine. And then elimination, anything unused, waste products, we eliminate. And this is the end of the digestive system.